It's a privilege to do this work for you. I speak on behalf of all the staff. We love what we do, and we love it when you come out like this. I don't understand how erotics did not get as many people as science. But okay. So, what do we do here at the University of Philosophical Research, especially when it comes to subjects like eroticism? Well, we could go in any number of directions here, but we like to go what we think is the deepest level of the issue. And so we begin usually with etymology. What's the word? How did the word come into being in the first place? And of course, as you see here, erotic is from the Greek word eros, which is the Greek god of love. There were erotes, by the way. There were several gods of love. You don't hear a lot about them because Eros takes all the press, but it literally is from love, eron, to love, erostai, to love and desire, which is of unknown origin. And I kind of like that because Eros was originally a primordial god. Now, you don't hear about this, right? But this is his original incarnation. Incarnation, that's not a good word for a god. This was his original existence. Hesiod's Theogony. Verily at first chaos, the chasm, came to be, but next wide-bosomed Gaia, earth, and the ever-sure foundation of all the deathless ones who hold the peaks of snowy Olympus, and then dim Tartarus, the pit, and the depth of the wide-pathed earth. So there's not much here, right? There's chaos, there's earth, there's the pit, and then there's love. And in the depth of the wide-pathed earth, Eros, fairest among the deathless gods, who unnerves the limbs and overcomes the mind and wise counsels of all gods and all men within them. From the cosmogony of Alcman, first came creation, after that, contriver, poros, right? Tekmor, ordinance or laws. And then Teknor came to being after Poros, thereupon called him contriver, since the beginning provided all things. The beginning provided all things. For when matter began to be set in order, a certain Poros came into being as the beginning, and Eros was born of the world egg, formed by Poros and Tekmor. So we get this, especially in China, the world egg, this kind of original egg, which came first, clearly the egg in this mythology. Plato, in his Timaeus, talks about this same myth and Eros being born of the golden egg, or the original egg. Aristophanes and the birds. At the beginning there was only chaos, air, night, darkness, and the pit, Gaia, etc. And then into this original mix comes love. And so love here is seen as a kind of active creative force. That's Eros at the beginning. Orphica, Argonautica. Firstly, the ancient chaos's stern inevitability, and Chronos, time, who bred with his boundless coils air and light, two-sexed, two-faced, glorious Eros. Wait, two-sexed? Two-faced, glorious Eros. Ever-born night's father, whom latter men called Phanes. That's another word for Eros, for he first was manifested. So again, the original story of Eros is that it's not even he, it's they. Two-sexed, two-faced, glorious Eros is kind of the creative urge of the universe, right? Yeah, and it goes on and on. So Eros, the primordial god, is the oldest understanding of love, of the God of love, right? So notice Aphrodite is not here, right? Because she comes much later. She's an Olympian god. This is an original primordial god, this chaos. And you can hear Oppian here and his work talk about this confusion, because you know Eros as Amor or Cupid even. And this was true even in the ancient world. And he says this in his address to Eros: whether you are the eldest born among the blessed gods, and from unsmiling chaos did arise with fierce and flaming torch, and did first establish the ordinances of wedded love and the order the rites of the marriage bed, or whether Aphrodite of many counsels bear you a winged god on soaring pinions. All right, so Eros has two origin stories. It actually has more than that. One as a primordial god, one as the son of Aphrodite. So you may know this story. Uranus is castrated and his genitals are thrown into the sea, and because he is a divine being, the sea boils up around them, making foam, and then Aphrodite is born from the foam. Aphros in Greek, foam. Aphrodite from the foam. Sappho says that, and many other ancient sources say, that Eros is born in that process in some way. So it's almost like Aphrodite emerges from the foam, and with her come Eros and another god. Sappho says, Eros, the child of Aphrodite, and Uranus, or heaven. So the son comes out and cuts off his father's genitals. It's an old story in Greece. And the genitals go into the ocean, and thence comes Aphrodite. Now compare this to Athena, who was not born of woman, who was born of Zeus's head. And you think, well, that's just silly stuff. It's just a detail in the story. It's not just a detail in the story, because myths make us who we are, and they make our societies what they are. And in fact, if you read a trilogy called the Oresteia by Aeschylus, you will see that the very moment of the transfer of an old paradigm that involved blood vengeance to the new paradigm of justice in the law court. And in that process, Athena must de-sex herself, or re-sex herself. Athena, the great goddess of wisdom, must become a man, or male. And she says so in the text. Only then can justice be served, says Aeschylus. And again, these are not just idle stories. These are stories that create culture and in fact create selves. When we talked about the philosophy of love, we read the Symposium, Plato's Symposium. You remember this double notion of Eros as primordial and Eros as son of Aphrodite came into play. So it's a bunch of drunk guys, and they're hanging out in the house, and they give speeches on love. And the first speech is about how it's all in praise of Eros. And the first one was like, well, you're the greatest god because you're the oldest god, Pausanias. And then the last one it says you're the greatest god because you're the youngest god, right? So Eros is great for all kinds of reasons, apparently. Yeah, listen to Aphrodite and the birth of Eros. There, as soon as she was seen in the neighboring harborage, that is Aphrodite in Lebanon, basically, she brought forth wild Eros, or love, first seed and beginning of generation, quickening guide of the system of the universe. See, there it is, quickening guide of the system of the universe. So they're mixing these origin stories all the time. And we're going to talk about why. The quick-legged boy, kicking manfully. Are we not men? I just love saying that. Not many people get it anymore. The quick-legged boy, kicking manfully with his lively legs, hastened the hard labor of that body without a nurse, and beat, this is a little graphic, and beat on the closed womb of his unwedded mother. Let me out. Then a hot one even before birth, this Eros, he shook his light wings and with a tumbling push opened the gates of birth. Thus quickly Eros leapt into his mother's gleaming arms and pounced at once upon her firm breasts, spreading himself over that nursing bosom. Untaught, he yearned for his food. He bit with his gums the end of the teat that was never milked before, and greedily drank all the milk of those breasts swollen with the pressure of life-giving drops. Okay. So he's the primordial quickener of the universe, and he's a greedy little shit at the same time, right? And so this double nature, it may even be more than two natures, plays through in the story of Eros. There is a story that Aphrodite and her son came in Syria to the river Euphrates, and there Typhoeus, the famous giant, suddenly appeared, and Aphrodite and her son threw themselves into the river, and there changed their forms to fishes. And by so doing, they escaped the danger of the tyrant. And so afterwards, the Syrians, who are adjacent to these regions, stopped eating fish, fearing to catch them, lest with like reason they seem either to oppose the protection of the gods or entrap the gods themselves. And of course, we know of Cupid and Psyche, Eros and Psyche, most famously from his relationship depicted in Apuleius' The Golden Ass. This is one of my favorite novels from the first century. It's about a guy who becomes an ass because he's messing around with witchcraft. Actually, he gets his girlfriend to try to do witchcraft, but she hasn't been trained in witchcraft, and so he wants to be a bird, but she turns him into an ass. Insert parable here, and the meaning here. And it's a really great story. It's a great adventure novel. And he just goes from one horrible state to another, and he and some other people have been they haven't been rescued. They're hiding out in a cave, and he hears this story of Eros and Psyche from one of the captives, one of the fugitives who are trying to escape. And you probably know it. It's Eros getting pricked with one of his own arrows, right? Wonderful story. And he woos a human woman who is outcast by her family. It's actually kind of an early version of the Cinderella story, but with a lot more sex and wildness. So he's a handsome boy, finally. He has these three personalities, personas: primordial creator, force of creation itself, Aphrodite's son, and all that means, and then just wanton boy, and that is the Cupid that you know, that's on your Valentine's Day cards. He's a handsome youth, fatherless, and so he's reckless, a little reckless. He's a trickster, like Hermes. Let me see, who is this? I'm sorry, I don't have the critic in front of me, but he says this: in this stage, Eros has nothing to do, the wanton boy stage, nothing to do with uniting the discordant elements of the universe or higher sympathy or love which binds humankind together. But he is purely the god of sensual love, who bears sway over the inhabitants of Olympus, as well as over men and all living creatures. He tames lions and tigers, breaks the thunderbolts of Zeus, deprives Heracles of his arms, and carries on his sport with the monsters of the sea. So he's wreckage. He like wrecks things with love. He also, remember, or let me tell you if you don't know, his arrows are not just about love. The golden arrows are, and they kindle love in anyone's heart who's touched by them, including Eros, as happens with Psyche. But he has leaden arrows too, and they produce aversion to a lover, right? So, yeah, the golden and the leaden arrows. Sometimes his eyes are covered so that he acts blindly. So this is the most recent stage of Eros evolution, is that he's just a blind, wrecking force. Anybody in touch with that? Yeah, love is a blind, wrecking force. It doesn't care who it destroys. It just takes people over. He, often associated with Hermes. Now, what about Aphrodite? Right? Because she's the goddess of love and Eros' mother. What's her story? So here is the story I was telling poorly earlier. Uranos, the sky, heaven, came, this is from Hesiod's Theogony again. Theogony means birth of the gods. So if you ever want to know where the gods come from, go to Theogony. Uranos, the sky, came bringing on night and longing for love. And he lay about Gaia, the earth, spreading himself full upon her. Then the sun Kronos, that's K-R-O-N, that is not C-H, it's not time, although it gets conflated later. The sun Kronos from his ambush stretched forth his left hand, and in his right hand took the great long sickle with jagged teeth. Yep, that's what's coming. And swiftly lopped off his own father's genitals and cast them away to fall behind him. And as soon as he had cut off the members with flint and cast them from the land into the surging sea, they were swept away over the main a long time, and a white foam spread around them from the immortal flesh, and in it there grew a maiden. First she drew near holy Cythera, which is another name for her, and from there afterwards she came to the sea-girt Kryptos, and came forth an awful and lovely goddess. I love that old sense of awful, full of awe, right? Awful and lovely goddess. And grass grew up around her and beneath her shapely feet. Gods and men called her Aphrodite and Aphrogenea, the foam-born, because she grew amid the foam, and etc. And she goes about. And with her went Eros, and comely Himeros, desire, followed her at birth at first. And then she went into the assembly of the gods because she was immortal. Homeric hymn, O Cytherea, Aphrodite, born in Cyprus, basically, I will sing. She gives kindly gifts to men. Smiles are ever on her lovely face, and lovely is the brightness that plays over it. Hail, goddess, queen of well-built Salamis and sea-girt Kypros, grant me a cheerful song, and now I will remember you with another song as well. To Aphrodite, illustrious, laughter-loving queen, sea-born, night-loving, of awful appearance. Again, awful is an awesome. From whom necessity first came, another god, necessity, Ananke, producing nightly all connecting things, etc. And then goes on to praise Aphrodite. She's in the Iliad. She, Helen of Troy, recognized the round, sweet throat of the goddess Aphrodite and her desirable breasts and her eyes that were full of shining. All right? But she's not great. I mean, she's jealous. She's the one who initially caused the Trojan War. She created the contest, and Hera didn't get chosen, and all hell broke loose. And, she kind of instigated that. So she's an interesting character, too. Not a creatrix, right, but a creature. Eros is a creator, at least he's primordial, her son. So what's happening here, right? There's flipping going on. There's many different personas happening. I think there's an answer to all this, and I think we're seeing something interesting in this kind of archaeology of the gods. But first, let's understand that the ancient world was full of eroticism, all right? I don't know how I got this, but I got it in my head early on. Probably comes from growing up in the South, that the further back you go, the more conservative things were. No, it might be the opposite, right? The ancients were incredibly erotic, celebrated sex, and not just, R-rated sex. They celebrated X-rated sex. One of my favorite goddesses is Ishtar, also known as Inanna, and she has this shepherd mortal who wants to woo her, and she's like, "You're a shepherd, get out of here." And so he's all right. I mean, he plays well, plays his game. He's got some game. And so she finally relents to him. And she says this. Now, this is one of the most ancient texts in the world. We're talking about 4,000 years. All right, just keep that in mind. What I tell you, Ishtar, Inanna says, let the singer weave into a song. And he did. What I tell you, let it flow from ear to mouth. Let it pass from old to young. The vulva, my vulva, and the horn. This is an ancient symbol, right, of a yoni and a bull, or bull's horns, right? Phallic, yoni, sorry. The boat of heaven is full of eagerness like the young moon. My untilled land lies fallow. And as for me, Inanna, who will plow my vulva? Who will plow my high field? Who will plow my wet ground? As for me, a young woman, who will plow my vulva? Who will station the ox there? Who will plow my vulva? Dumuzi, the shepherd, says, great lady, the king will plow your vulva. I, Dumuzi, the king, will plow your vulva. Inanna, then plow my vulva. Man of my heart, plow my vulva. Now, the agricultural metaphors there are deliberate because sex and agriculture were the same thing. Well, they weren't the same thing, but they had a symbolic resonance, shall we say. Listen to this. At the king's lap stood the rising cedar. Calm down. Plants grew high by their side, right? Because this is the marriage of the sky and the earth that produces, right? Life, basically, fruit, grain, life. Plants grew high by their side. Grains grew high by their side. Gardens flourished luxuriantly. And then Inanna says, he has sprouted. He has burgeoned. His lettuce, by the way, lettuce is an ancient symbol of life. His lettuce is planted by the water. He is the one my womb loves best, my well-stocked garden of the plain, my barley growing high in its furrow, my apple tree, which bears fruit up to the crown. His lettuce is planted by the water, my favorite line. My honey man sweetens me always. My Lord, the honey man of the gods. He is the one my womb loves best. His hand is honey. His foot is honey. That's, boy, foot is honey. He sweetens me always. My eager, impetuous caresser of the navel, Dumuzi. My caresser of my soft thighs. He is the one my womb loves best. His lettuce is planted by the water. Whew, yes. All right, lest you think I'm depraved, let's go to the Bible. I guess you can still think I'm depraved, but I'm reading from the Bible. Song of Songs. Anybody read this? It's in the Hebrew Bible. It's amazing. The word God is not mentioned once. It's just about two lovers. Here it is. I am a rose of Sharon, a lily of the valleys. As a lily among brambles, so is my love among maidens. As an apple tree among the trees of the wood, so is my beloved among young men. With great delight I sat in his shadow, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. He brought me to the banqueting house, and his intention toward me was love. Sustain me with raisins, refresh me with apples, for I am faint with love. Oh, that his left hand were under my head and that his right hand embraced me. So the Hebrew Bible is especially noted for euphemism. So his right hand was embracing her. I'll let you fill in the blanks there. I slept, but my heart was awake. Listen, my beloved is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one. For my head is wet with dew, my locks with the drops of the night. I had put off my garment. Should I put it on again? I had bathed my feet. Should I soil them? My beloved thrust his hand into the opening, and my inmost being yearned for him. I arose to open to my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh, my fingers with liquid myrrh upon the handles of the bolt. I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had turned and gone. Oh no, so close. How fair and pleasant you are, oh loved one, delectable maiden. So now here's her lover responding back. I love this line. You are stately as a palm tree, and your breasts are like its clusters. I will climb that palm tree and lay hold of its branches. May your breasts be like clusters of the vine, and the scent of your breath like apples, and your kisses like the best wine that goes down smoothly, gliding over lips and teeth. I am my beloved's, and his desire is for me. Sappho, of course, is all about love, and it's a shame we don't have more of her poetry. Sappho of Lesbos, by the way. We have some fragments of her poetry. That man to me seems equal to the gods, the man who sits opposite you and close by listens to your sweet voice and your enticing laughter that has indeed stirred up the heart in my breast. For whenever I look at you, even briefly, I can say no longer a thing. But my tongue is frozen in silence. Instantly, a delicate flame runs underneath my skin. With my eyes, I see nothing. With my ears, they make a whirring noise. A cold sweat covers me. Trembling seizes my body. I am greener than grass, lacking but little of death do I seem. And of course, the Kama Sutra, which I will not show you. You can look up on your own. But it actually comes from a Upanishad, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which reads this, thusly: a fire, that woman is, Gautama. Her firewood is the vulva. Her smoke is the pubic hair. Her flame is the vagina. When one penetrates her, that is her embers, and her sparks are the climax. In that very fire, the gods offer semen, and from that offering springs a person. Now, I almost took this out because I don't want to get weird about tantric yoga, but it is worth saying that it is unique in Eastern philosophy in that, and this is George Firestein, scholar of tantric yoga. Tantric yoga, he says, introduced a battery of means, that is, myths and rituals, that hitherto had been excluded from the spiritual repertoire of mainstream Hinduism, notably goddess worship and sexuality. He continues, the great tantric formula, which is fundamental also to Mahayana Buddhism, is that samsara equals nirvana. That is to say, the conditional or the phenomenal world is coessential with the transcendental. Now, if you know anything about the constellation of belief that is Hinduism, you know that this isn't it. This is unique, right? Hinduism, especially Vedic Hinduism, is not so interested in the body. In fact, is trying to escape the body. The body pulls you down into samsara. Accordingly, the tantric adepts reclaimed for the spiritual process all those aspects of existence that the mainline Hindu traditions had excluded by way of renunciation: sexuality, the body, the physical universe at large. And they did this, he says, by reinstating anima, the feminine principle, which is called Shakti, and depicted in such ways as through goddesses Kali, Durga, Parvati, etc. There's also, there's a whole New Testament you don't know about, right? There's a whole group of writings about Jesus and about early Christianity that didn't make it through the censors. And actually one of these is called the Gospel of Thomas, and it's the oldest record we have of Jesus, written only a couple of decades after his death. All the other Gospels are written at least 40 years, sometimes 60 years after Jesus' death. But this Gospel of Thomas was written right around 50 of the Common Era. So we got all kinds of things. There's also the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. You should read this stuff. It's wonderful. And it's Jesus' childhood. So, you don't get Jesus' childhood in the canonical Gospels. And there's great stuff there where he messes with the kids his age. I mean, you're Jesus, so, and you're 7. If you're Jesus and you're 7, you're going to mess with people, aren't you? And so he's like, they're like, I don't mean to get off on this. I just think it's so fun. He and his buds they're up by the creek and they're making these little dirt birds. And one of them says, "My bird looks a lot better than yours, Jesus." And Jesus goes, the bird flies away. Anyway, I could go on and on. Jesus and Judas meet as children. This is awesome. Maybe we'll do a whole series or something just on these scriptures that didn't make it in. One of these is a book called The Acts of Paul and Thecla. Now, Paul, as you may know, was the apostle to the Gentiles. And so Peter and James were back in Jerusalem, and frankly, they thought Christianity was just a kind of Reformed Judaism. And so they're there, and, they're telling these Christians they have to be circumcised because, what else would you do, right? And Paul's like, hey, I can't go out there. I can't go outside of Jerusalem and tell these Corinthians, these Ephesians, these worldly Greek and Roman peoples that they have to cut the ends of their penises off. That's not going to play, all right? So we got to decide this here and now. And they have a big fight. This is all in the canonical New Testament, by the way. They have a big fight, and Peter and James like, you do you. That's the Greek translation. You do you, and go out there among those people, and we'll stay here. And he did. And so he has these amazing adventures, not all of which get recorded in the canonical New Testament. And one of them is the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And I can't rehearse the whole story for you, but you should read it sometime. It's rather amazing. So I forget where he is. He might be in Corinth, and he's preaching. So he would go and preach on the street as people did in the ancient world. And there's a woman named Thecla. She's an aristocratic woman, and she's engaged to be married to this local dude. And she's sitting by her window. Well, see, already, right, we've got the setting for a great love story. She's sitting by her window, and she hears this powerful man speak. And she gives up everything to follow him. And she, it's all cloaked in this notion of virginity and chastity, but, well, listen, I mean, just, and she becomes a great martyr, and, it's all about her chastity. And I'm like, I think you're talking too much about the chastity, but maybe I'm just weird. Here's a line from it. So the guys are freaking out, as we do, right? Because his bros are there. And they're like, dude, what happened to Thecla? Who's this guy? And they're like, we're going to kick his ass. And again, that's from the Greek. And he's like, I don't know. She just started listening to this guy. And so here's this part of this dialogue. We can't tell exactly who he is, but we know that he deprives young men of their intended wives, St. Paul, and virgins of their intended husbands by teaching. By teaching. Teaching is quite erotic, by the way. We don't have to get into that. There can be no future resurrection unless you continue in chastity and do not defile your flesh. Okay, got it. Great story. Anyway, what's going on here? I want to introduce you to a book that I doubt that you know, and I'm sorry that you don't. If you don't, if you do, good for you. You may have heard of Rian Eisler's Chalice and the Blade, and it's a very powerful book. And do we have it in the bookstore, Brooke?
Yes.
Oh, good. Do we have Sacred Pleasure?
Not yet.
Did somebody tell you to order that?
Yes, someone did.
Thank you, Brooke. You're a good bookstore manager. Her second book is called Sacred Pleasure. And I think it's much more powerful. And I don't ever see it cited or used. And I think it's amazing. So I just want to spend the rest of the time sharing with you her work. And I want you to keep in mind that this book is about this thick. So I'm doing it a grave injustice to talk about it in 10 or 15 minutes. But I want to give you a sense of what she says, because it's about the erotic. It's about the history of the erotic, of pleasure, right? And how we screwed it up. So, using the work of Maria Gimbutas, whom some of you may know, her works are up at Pacifica, she relies on that archaeology to determine this. And Gimbutas came to the same conclusion. A book called The Language of the Goddess, Gimbutas. Quote from Eisler: what can we learn from this Paleolithic religious imagery, some of which is there on the slide, some of which you will recognize, the early Venus figures, Venus being a word for Aphrodite, the Roman. One, she says, is that sexuality and the rebirth of nature in the spring, Northern Hemisphere spring, prominently featured in Paleolithic religious imagery. I guess it's spring in the Southern Hemisphere, but she's in old Europe. And we know that religious symbols and myths are frequently expressed through religious rites. A second, so the first is that religious symbols and myths frequently expressed through religious rites. A second is that the erotic rite that scholars call sacred marriage, kairos gamos, is a theme in the later religious art of both the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. It even survives in the mystical traditions. This is very important, in the mystical traditions. A third is that there are clues to such traditions in the many well-known European folk festivals where, in some places well into the 19th and even the 20th centuries, young women and men would go together into fields to make love on May Day, to celebrate the annual return of spring. So, sex equals pleasure in the ancient world, or it did. Sex was about pleasure. She says this: to our prehistoric ancestors, sex was integral to the cosmic order, and for whom the body of woman was not, as the medieval church would later proclaim, a source of carnal evil, but an attribute of the great goddess herself. These erotic rites would have had a very different meaning. They would have been rituals of alignment with the life-giving female and male powers of the cosmos, often represented in Paleolithic art. So for them, these ancient people, partaking in the pleasures of sex would not have been sinful, but on the contrary, a way of connecting to the goddess. And in fact, we see this. We can see this in the stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is a king in Uruk, and he's pretty proud of himself, and he's prancing around. And meanwhile, he's kind of a jerk too, but he's not a bad, he's kind of a bad king at times. He'll take prima nocta, he'll take wives and have them on the night of their wedding. So I guess that's not cool. Now that I think about it, his vices tend to be sexual. His virtues tend to be material. But anyway, there's a wild man in the woods named Enkidu. Enkidu is a wild man. He drinks with the cattle. So when the cattle come to the pond or the creek to drink, Enkidu is there with them, drinking. He is a man of nature. He is a man, he's a man, an uncultured man, right? He's drinking with the cattle out of the pond. Gilgamesh hears about him. Of course, Gilgamesh, being Gilgamesh, hears about him, wants to fight him. and this is relevant to the story. So he sends, I forget her name, Shidra, I think, S-H-I, Shidra. He sends the temple. See, it's hard to describe this. The ancient texts, the scholarship calls it a temple prostitute. And I don't like that term, but she was the ritual practitioner of the goddess connection in the temple. Men would go there to have sex with her to connect to the Divine Mother. He says, go get him and bring him to me so I can kick his ass. And she does, but as is often the case, she's the wisest one in the story and has the least voice. She brings him to her temple and seduces him, and they make love for days. That's how he becomes human. It's because he has been inducted into the divine feminine. She also takes him and gets him drunk, which is another important ritual. But the days that they make love, you should read the description. It would go with the other text I read you. It's sacred, right? It's sacred, sacred pleasure. Sex was pleasure because it was connected to life. It was pleasurable in its own right, but it was also pleasurable cosmically. This is eroticism, right? Eisler says, I am proposing that prehistoric erotic myths and rites were not only expressions of our ancestors' joy and gratitude for the goddess's gift of life, and that is the goddess's gift. This is not diminishing the male role or the male principle here at all, but men don't have children, but also expressions of joy and gratitude for the goddess's gifts of love and pleasure, particularly for the most intense of physical pleasure, the pleasure of sex. Why wouldn't this be our most sacred thing? It's a perfect symbol of union. It's a perfect symbol of losing yourself into something larger than you, right? But what did we do with it? What did we make it? We made it a sin, right? And the myths turn it so that it becomes a sin. To the point where St. Augustine in 400 will write in The City of God that sin is in the semen. Sin is in the semen. So every time you're now having sex and ejaculating, you're spreading sin. Nice. Thank you. Appreciate that. What's that going to, right? And that's going to be for both partners, right? Like, what are we doing? We're spreading sin. Oh my God. And we've lived that way for centuries, for millennia. When there's evidence. Now, we're talking about archaeology, and she's very careful not to overdraw these things. Again, I'm presenting her in a way that is not quite fair because I'm trying to get to the highlights, but really thick book, documented heavily. Sex should be our most sacred, precious, human activity because it is connected to life and it's connected to pleasure, mutual pleasure. How awesome is that? That's the very reason the church and other patriarchal institutions zero in on it, still zero in on it. Because if you can control that by remaking it, you can control a lot. So, she says this. Let's go back to our friend Eros, primordial god, son of Aphrodite, and then silly, mischievous boy with a weapon. She says this, in Roman times, as Cupid or Amor or Eros changed further into a naked, winged little boy, he was still the son and companion of Venus, the Roman goddess of love. Sorry, losing my mouse. There it is. The Roman goddess of love. And as a deity, he still retained. Now, this is really important because it's so simple and easy to think that one story ends and another story begins, and that never happens. The stories get mixed up with each other and get all tangled like the Eros stories and the Aphrodite story. He still retained that old notion of the primeval energy of the universe. And when you have sex, isn't that it? The primeval energy? What could be more primal? What could be more generative, right? And not just reproductively. All right, I got to let her talk, sorry. As a deity, he still retained what we today would call a spiritual dimension, manifesting love and sex as attributes of the divine. But now he was not just capricious, he was downright malicious. And now he also had a brother. Remember I told you about his brother Anteros, who accompanied him, quote, as the avenger of unrequited love, or the opposer of love. The opposer, his brother. How did all this happen, Eisler says? What happened to the goddess as the divine source of life and pleasure? What became of all the images of female sexual creativity? When did we begin to think it natural? Oh, this is the worst word we've ever made. Natural. I can come back to that. When did we begin to think it natural that erotic love should come from a weapon? How did we move to an institution of marriage in which woman's sexuality becomes male property under the control of male deities and of men? Well, she says we have some evidence for this. Again, it's sketchy. It's archaeological. James Mellart writes that by 4500 BCE, interesting date, that's the date of the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of Ishtar or Inanna, we begin to see, he says, clear signs of stress in the archaeological landscape of the Middle East. Old artistic traditions, he writes, begin to disappear, and in many areas there's evidence of invasions, natural catastrophes, sometimes both. What happened? Beginning around 4500 and continuing for several more millennia to trigger such large movements of population. As Gimbutas notes, the domestication of the horse around 5000 BCE gave the pastoralists who overran old Europe their vehicle of transportation, but also their vehicle of conquest. What else? Climate change. James DeMayo writes that the mass population of movements out of these areas, so the argument is, and the evidence seems to be, that there were natural catastrophes that made people move. And in moving, they came in contact with different kinds of people, right? And in moving, they were exhibiting signs of stress. These changes to what Eisler calls a dominator culture, as opposed to the partnership culture that she believes came before, believes that these movements, these mass migrations, radically altered the ancient world. These harsh environmental conditions, he says, were the switch that set off a complex sequence of events. Famine, social chaos, land abandonment, and mass migration that eventually led to a fundamental shift in the prevailing social and sexual organization in the mainstream of human culture evolution. He believes, DeMeo, that these are, and pardon me, Christo, I shouldn't use this word after last night's lecture where post-traumatic stress is not a good term, clinical term, but DeMeo says these cultures suffered post-traumatic stress, a cultural post-traumatic stress, rather than being random, because how do you explain this? How do you explain the culture of the blade with these cultures coming down from the steppes, the Asian steppes, and overtaking these agricultural centers with violence? How do you, he says, this is the result of cultural trauma that comes from all these changes and desperation that comes from it. It is the outcome of traumatic experiences and practices that evolved during severe climatic and environmental changes. Wilhelm Reich, one of the originators of psychology, proposed that psychological armory is the deadening of positive emotions and eventually the addiction to pain. And it's the consequence of severe trauma. And these traumas can be caused by droughts or other extreme environmental hardships. We were talking about this last night with Christo's talk on trauma. Adverse childhood factors, and someone asked about cultural, that how it happens on a cultural level. This is what she was talking about. In fact, there are other studies, Eisler says, supportive of DeMeo's conclusion that extreme environmental stress can lead to a dominator social organization. Anthropologist Peggy Reeves Sanday's survey of more than 100 tribal societies indicates that at least in some cultures, again, we're not talking about blanket statements here, in her words, quote, men react to stress caused by food shortage or by the circumstances of migration by banding together, excluding women from male-oriented power ceremonies, and by turning aggression against women. And in fact, she says that this would go hand in glove with the domestication of animals, of enslaving living beings, which would be unheard of in most indigenous cultures, right, for the production of meat and other products. So, here's her argument. Not only through systematic cruelty to women and children, but also through warfare and despotic strongman rule, is what we see in the archaeological record. It is also what we will, to varying degrees, see in societies that are characterized by chronic warfare, rigid male dominance, and strongman rule in both the family, state, or tribe. In terms of family, institutionally, it is, Eisler again, it is reflected in what are today increasingly recognized dysfunctional families based on control in deeply entrenched patterns of violence against women and children and in chronic warfare. Politically, it is reflected in the despotic tribal and state controls, and characteristically vary in proportion to degree, of course. Culturally, it's reflected in the surviving myths idealizing male violence and domination, and equating true masculinity with the suppression of not only inferior peoples, but of inferior feelings. That is, stereotypically feminine feelings, such as caring, compassion, empathy, and sexually, it is reflected in the still all too prevalent equation of sexual pleasure with acts of domination and cruelty. Looking at you, pornography. And lest you think this is airy theorizing, this has been documented by Susan Faludi in her book, Stiffed, The Betrayal of the American Man. She wrote the book Backlash about the reaction to feminism, and she's an incredible journalist, one of the greatest researchers I've ever seen. I mean, some of her book is, a good portion of her book is footnote. So she was confused. So she had studied the backlash to feminism in the 90s. And, okay, she kind of saw what was happening. She's like, but why are men, what's up with men? And so she goes to Long Beach, and she attends a domestic abusers group. And she hangs out with these guys. And she's like, what are you doing? Why are you hitting the people you love? Why are you hurting the people you love? And again, I'm not doing her book justice, but basically it's because they had lost their story. And because of what Eisler said, that men, when they feel loss, especially loss of their story, especially loss of their identity, which comes to the story, become violent. Again, I'm not doing that justice, but there is an incredible contemporary, relatively contemporary, 1957 example of this. So this is the film, The Incredible Shrinking Man. And she does quite a bit with this in her book. And I never saw it before. I thought it was a great movie about a little guy who's trying to kill a big spider. It's so deep. This is the opening scene of The Incredible Shrinking Man. Right? How awesome is that? He doesn't die fighting the spider, which, would be Achilles. That's what Achilles would do. And they'd still be fighting the spider in the underworld. Did you hear about me fighting that spider? Get me out of here so I can still fight that spider. No, it's like, it's not really about me, is it? And what a beautiful ending of Atman, the self, merging into Brahman, right? The one. What are the erotics of love today? It's what Eisler says. Return to the mystical. She says very early in Western culture, dance was used to attain mystical trances. Since ancient times, people have used meditation, breathing exercises, hallucinogens, fasting, and deprivation of sleep to induce heightened or altered states of consciousness. Why not sex as the avenue to the sacred? We live and we love. Eisler says, even under this staggering load of what she calls dominator culture, we have still managed to love one another. What a tribute to the human capacity and tenacity for seeking pleasure rather than pain, for caring rather than conquest, and above all, connection with one another and with all that is creative and loving in ourselves and in the world. This human capacity and tenacity also offer us realistic hope that we can turn this critical point in human history to create a social system that is more balanced and less insane, one where violence and domination, along with sexual and spiritual dysfunction, will no longer be considered just the way things are, or natural. I hate that word, natural. And this hope is today further supported by the fact that much of modern history has been the struggle to break free from our dominator bondage, from millennia-long traditions of violent coercion, inhuman repression, and endless bloodshed. And it's happening. It's out there. It's not so much on the media that we consume, but it's out there. Listen to Hélène Cixous, the French feminist, writing in an essay called The Laugh of the Medusa. I too overflow. My desires have invented new desires. My body knows unheard of songs. Time and again, I too have felt so full of luminous torrents that I could burst with forms much more beautiful than those which are put up in frames and sold for a fortune. Sacred pleasure. Eisler says, this is a sacredness that is of this world, not out there. It's here. It's not a disembodied, otherworldly realm. It's a sacredness that derives from a reverence for life, not for what comes after death or before birth. It is a sacredness that does not make a sharp divide between us and what we call the divine. Above all, it is a sacredness that does not view the bodily or carnal, the erotic, we might say, as lesser and therefore unimportant, but rather as an essential part of what is holy. You know who else knew this? Walt Whitman, because he knew so much. I sing the body electric. The armies of those I love engirth me, and I engirth them. They will not let me off until I go with them, respond to them, and discorrupt them, and charge them full with the charge of the soul. Was it doubted that those who corrupt their own bodies conceal themselves? And if those who defile the living are as bad as those who defile the dead? And what does the body, and if the body does not do as much as the soul, and if the body were not the soul, what is the soul? The body is the soul. The love of the body of a man or woman balks account. The body balks account. That of the male is perfect, and that is the female is perfect. And then here's one of my favorite lines ever that I sometimes use around here. I perceived that to be with those I like is enough. It's enough. To stop in company with the rest at evening is enough. To be surrounded by beautiful, curious, breathing, laughing flesh is enough. To pass among them or touch anyone or rest my arm ever so lightly around his neck or her neck for a moment, what is this then? I do not ask any more delight. I swim in it as in a sea.